So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa salatu wa salamu ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So, as I was saying, this is a sort of a brief presentation, about half an hour inshallah, and I'll be talking about the political thought of Sunni Islamism. I'll be explaining what I mean by Islamism in just a moment. And we're looking at modernity, which is a very broad concept. Secularism, we'll consider briefly. Democracy, we're all familiar with. And also, terrorism doesn't really fit into that category, but I'll consider how Sunnis have dealt with ideas that are concerned with terrorism, and the tendency of certain groups, certain Sunni bodies, to engage and perpetrate terrorist violence. This is not to say, of course, that terrorism is a sort of distinctly Islamic or even a distinctly Sunni tendency, but in the frame of the discussion that I'm looking at, this is quite relevant. Unfortunately, this has stopped working again.
You need to point it here.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. Okay, so what is an Islamist? I'm using Islamism to refer to a term, a trend or a movement that is basically inspired by the Muslim Brothers. And the Muslim Brothers, if you're not familiar with Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, they've been in the news lately. They are the movement inspired by or set up by someone called Hassan al-Banna in Egypt around the year 1928. And alongside, there have been analogous movements in places like the Indian subcontinent, led by people like Maududi. These don't come out of vacuums. They have antecedents. There are significant sort of events that take place in the Muslim world during these periods. And of course, this is at the tail end of the colonial period. So we still have various parts of the Muslim world under occupation. And perhaps particularly notable is in the 1920s, you have the fall of the Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, the final sort of the final political representation in a global sense of global Sunnism, you could say. And so it's in that context that you have these movements emerging, and they are very much concerned about the place of Islam in public life. Sometimes they're referred to as mainstream Islamists, and they are, as I see it, one of the three main Sunni denominations that exist in the Middle East. And I've kind of highlighted Middle East there deliberately because, unfortunately or fortunately, this is a very Middle East-centric presentation. It reflects my own research, but I also think there is a great deal of significance to these particular tendencies in the Middle East. So the other tendencies I've marked out as Sufis and Salafis, and then you have Islamists. And none of these terms is really entirely satisfactory as a designation. By Sufi, I'm actually more commonly I use the term traditional Islam, capital T traditional Islam, because in the English language they often refer to themselves as traditional Muslims. But one could say that this is the tendency that is represented by the official line of the Azhar as an institution, the Azhar University. Salafis, again, an amorphous sort of group, but a lot of it goes back to the movement of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in present-day Saudi Arabia, and the Islamists, as I've already defined them, are people who are inspired by the sorts of movements set up by the Muslim Brothers. Islamist as a term of abuse. The term Islamist is very often used in a very pejorative sense in popular discourse, whether it's in the media, whether it's in political discourse. I'm using, the usage I'm making of the term Islamism is more common in academia. So academics, they use categories more carefully than is common in media discourses. And so occasionally some academics do use Islamist in the sense that you find in the press. But very often in the press, Islamist is a catch-all term which includes extremist groups like ISIS. It will include groups like the Deobandis in the Indian subcontinent, who are who don't really fit into that mold at all, and are hostile to the groups that I'm calling Islamists. I would be remiss if I were not to define Islamists as they themselves will very often define them. So the term that they use, you'll get this in the last slide. This is the Arabic word. Can anyone read that? Does anyone want to give it a shot? It's not. Islamiyun. So in the Arab world, they self-identify as Islamiyun. And here, this is someone called Sheikh Salman al-Awda. He has a book where he discusses, it was written in the wake of the Arab Spring, and he discusses basically, how Islamists, quote unquote, should participate in this. And so he spends some time reflecting on what an Islamist is. But roughly speaking, these are Muslims who seek to imbue social and political life of Muslim societies with Islamic values.
So, sorry, just one quick announcement. Apologies for interrupting. There are a couple of cars which are blocking others in the nursery. There are a couple of people there. FG09CXT and CN53WCJ. If anyone is if anyone here? No? Anyone blocking?
Just the Friday night crowd.
No one blocking. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so I think this definition is, it's a very frequently sort of seen definition. So an Islamist defines themselves as a Muslim who actively seeks to imbue the social and political life of Muslim societies with Islamic values. And what this sort of highlights is, they're obviously Muslims, but they have a certain sort of like raison d'etre to their being Muslim that has implications in wider society. That is not to say, and these people very often highlight this, that a non-Islamist is not a Muslim. Okay, but there is something positive in their view with being an Islamist, obviously contrary to widespread discourses in the media. Okay, so if I can get the next slide. Okay, so how do Islamists engage modernity? This is obviously a huge question, and I'm going to, I've kept all of these things just to keep you interested. I can't possibly cover all of that. But the nation state, secularism, democracy, these are all, in a sense, components of modernity. And if you want, we can have a conversation about what exactly is modernity. Multi-party politics, that's kind of linked to democracy. Religious minorities, jihad, the Caliphate. Okay, so I've already mentioned the Caliphate. Okay, so how do Islamists engage with various sort of components of modernity? And being an academic, I'm going to not be able to get through a lecture without mentioning some of the big names in sort of like the discussions about the nation state and modernity from mainstream academia. So this book on the right is Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. It's one of the most influential statements on the nature of nations. And he basically says a nation is an imagined community, which is not to say it's a fake community, but it's something which happens through people's sort of engaging with a sense of identity that is made in their minds. Okay, it's not something that exists out there that you can sort of feel or measure in a very strict sense. And in the modern world, you have, the sort of the English as a nation, the Scottish as a nation. Kind of a bad example because we're part of the United Kingdom, so we're part of technically one country. But the idea of nationalism helped create nation states, which are the most fundamental form of political actor on the international stage today. So if you had an empire in the past, that doesn't count anymore. Do you have a nation state? Do you have a territorially defined sort of legal structure which you have power over? And in Arabic sometimes it's called ad-dawla al-qutriya, which highlights the territoriality of it. Literally that means the territorial state. And this is something which is new to Muslims. Muslims have had empires, very often competing empires in the past, but there was a unity, assumed unity in the Muslim ummah, so to speak. And suddenly, with the rise of modernity and a world order that was imposed on Muslims rather than being of their own making, they have to contend with this category, the nation. And so you have discussions about nation versus ummah arising in the context of modernity. And the reason I mention this in the context of Islamism is that, and I'm quoting Shadi Hamid here, he's a scholar at the Brookings Institution. He's not an Islamist, he's just an academic at the Brookings Institution in DC. He basically says that Islamism can be described as one of the efforts by Muslims to reconcile the religious tradition with the modern nation state and the modern world order. Whether it's successful or not is a different question. The second thing that I had listed on that sort of wish list at a couple of slides ago was secularism. And I thought I'd start by asking, what is secularism? Does anyone want to hazard a guess or try to answer that question? You can cheat by looking at the screen, but does anyone want to sort of like contest my definition? So I've got here separation of church and state. I've got a question mark there. Neutrality between all religions. Okay. Would anyone define secularism any differently, or? So I mean, secularism is a very, very contested concept. Okay. There is a huge amount of debate about what secularism actually is among political philosophers, and so the separation of church and state, for example, has been under attack as a conception of secularism in recent years, maybe in the last decade to 2 decades. There's been a suggestion that neutrality is different from separation of church and state, and that's more important as a marker. But one of the things that all secularists agree on is that the modern nation state should not have a religious identity in any significant sense. Okay, so we happen to be in a country which is Church of England, but it doesn't really have a significant impact, arguably, on the identity of the state. Whereas, I would subscribe to that argument that it doesn't have a massive impact. Some people might say, well, the Queen is the head of state and the head of the church and so on, but I think that's sort of like not very significant personally. Islamists would not accept that. Okay, so Islamists usually reject secularism as a legitimate principle in Muslim majority countries, societies. I've highlighted Muslim majority societies because obviously it doesn't apply to a sort of a non-Muslim society. And you have Islamists, I can think of someone like Yusuf al-Qaradawi stating very explicitly, countries with diverse religious and ethnic groups should be secular. Okay, so an Islamist can actually advocate secularism in a non-Muslim country. Okay, but they would say no, a Muslim society has to have a religious imprint to that society. Okay, which is in the context of modernity, this is an assertion which goes against prevailing norms of modern states, norms that are often, obviously defined by the sort of Euro-American consensus on these matters. And the state should, according to Islamists, promote Islam in some fashion. To quote Rashid Ghannouchi, who's actually a Tunisian, but was for a very long time lived not too far from here, as far as I understand. He basically says Muslim society should, an Islamic state should be a place where Muslims can sort of live a holistic religious life, and the state should try and cultivate that environment as much as it could, without being coercive, while respecting the rights of minorities to practice their faith. So they say that it should have a religious imprint, but minorities should also have a right to sort of practice their faith. And a lot of Western theorists or Western sort of observers of Islamism would say, well, those are two irreconcilable sort of perspectives. And if you want to have a discussion about that, I'd be happy to talk about it. But I think there is a tension, at least as framed and conceived of by Western scholars, about how nation states should operate, that if a state has a religious identity, then that necessarily will marginalize a religious minority, so to speak. But as I say, Islamists do not see any contradiction in those two. What about democracy? So Islamists actually very strongly promote democracy. Of the different formations I've looked at, the Sufis, the Salafis, and the Islamists, at least in the Middle East, the Islamists are the most enthusiastic about democracy. Publicly active Sufis tend to be very hostile, and Salafis have tended to be, in general, quite hostile to democracy. So Islamists are interesting in this regard. They were strongly behind the Arab Spring, and I mean, they're also sort of able to get quite a bit of a constituency as a consequence of, this is from the Pew Research Center. They have a fantastic sort of survey of Muslim public opinion taken over several years that was published, I think, in 2013, but I'll have to look that up again. And as you can see from this, and these are major sort of, well, not all of them are major Muslim countries, but these are a number of Muslim countries. Indonesia is obviously the largest one there. It's the largest Muslim country in the world. Pakistan, I think, is the second largest Muslim majority country in the world. But you have, in general, a majority. Pakistan's the only exception there, where there's a don't know line here as well, which I've deleted because it was a bit too sort of big, a graphic. But, you know, Pakistan is the outlier in a sense. Everyone else actually is relatively enthusiastic about democracy as a form of government. And, but, you know, the democracy that Islamists promote is Islamic democracy. It's not liberal democracy. And that's an important distinction. Liberalism for Islamists is seen as something distinct from democracy as a form of representative government. Whereas in Western sort of discourses on democracy, liberalism has increasingly been seen as you know, indispensable as a sort of a part of the democratic framework. And one of the things I've added here is democracy as an alternative to autocracy. I think one of the ways to understand the Islamist enthusiasm for a democracy is Islamists of these groups of these denominations I've spoken of are the only sort of significant formation in the Middle East that are concerned about politics in a significant way, that want to have an influence on politics. And as a consequence, democracy is really a means to do that. And it's a means of countering autocracy, so to speak. Autocracy is the status quo in those regions. And so supporting democracy is a means of resisting the status quo, in a sense, in that region. The Islamist theory of democracy. This is quite brief. There's a lot more that could be said here. And I mean, in a sense, this is a summary of a 10,000-word chapter in my dissertation. But and not a very good summary at that. But Islamists, when they theorize democracy, they say that sovereignty belongs to the ummah as a whole. Okay, but then they sort of place a condition on that. So Islamists from the mid-20th century very often would say things like sovereignty belongs to God. Okay, and more recently they tend to say things like sovereignty belongs to the ummah. So, but it has this limit. Okay, so the ummah sovereignty has one limit. This is one Islamist I'm quoting. It cannot permit the impermissible nor prohibit the permissible. لا تحل حراما ولا تحرم حلالا. And you know, that is expanded on considerably. But Imara in particular, Muhammad Imara is an Egyptian Islamist. The way he explains that is anything which is a matter of ijma' is what cannot. Well, actually, he doesn't define it in that way. He says. And I'm going to get a bit technical here, so please bear with me. If something is قطعي الدلالة قطعي الورود, meaning there's no question as to its applicability, for example, that Muslims should pray 5 times a day. There are just a handful of things which are of this nature. Something which is unimpeachable in the authenticity of the source, meaning it's from a mutawatir hadith or it's from the Quran. And alongside that, it's absolutely clear in its meaning. There can't be difference of opinion about it. Those are the things which are the realm of halal and haram, according to Muhammad Imara, which actually is a very small component of the Islamic religious tradition. Arguably, it's, you know, a percentage point of the Islamic tradition. It's all the big, you know, the 5 pillars of Islam, for example. I mean, even just to give you a somewhat strange example, but the consumption of alcohol is there's some disagreement on it, because Hanafis say that the alcohol that's mentioned in the Quran is khamr, which is date wine, which is grape wine. Okay, and so the other ones are prohibited by qiyas and not by the explicit sort of text of the Quran. And so even in those sorts of realms, you can see there's room for maneuver. The reason I'm highlighting this is not that Islamists want to promote the consumption of sort of grape-based alcohol, but that this sort of a statement could be construed in very narrow terms, and it could be construed in very broad terms. And what really matters is how is it being construed. Okay. The other thing I would say is they very often use terms like wakil or ajir to say to designate the ruler. So the ruler is actually a representative, and that's a contractual relationship in Sharia, which has all sorts of implications, such as the permissibility of removing the ruler if they're not fulfilling their obligations, to sort of regulate the ruler's behavior and so on. And so this is again a way of getting beyond despotic rulership and having more limited powers. And finally, this is very interesting. So Muhammad al-Hassan al-Dado is a Mauritanian Islamist. He's one of the younger scholars, I think born 1963, who, or possibly 62. And he has an interesting elaboration of, someone asks him in a conference that, has democracy got anything to do with Islam? In a slightly hostile fashion, he's asked. And he basically presents a sort of off the cuff, he's a very brilliant scholar, off the cuff in a 15-minute response, he elaborates a detailed theory of justifying democracy based on the Quran and Sunnah. And it's interesting to sort of see the sorts of statements he makes. One of the things he says is the head of state can be female or even non-Muslim, because they're a wakil. And a wakil can even be a non-Muslim. It can even be a child, technically, from a legal perspective. And the reason he's saying this is because this is not, the head of state is not a caliph. He's the head of a region of the Muslim Ummah, so to speak. The caliph might have certain restrictions historically because, there's more or less agreement that the caliph should be a man, so to speak. But that doesn't apply to the nation state, according to Ad-Dado, which opens up all sorts of other possibilities as well. Okay, so that talks about, this is a discussion of some of the political theory. As I say, the range of topics that can be covered under the heading that I gave could go on for hours and hours. So this is just a brief snippet. We've had a look at secularism, we've had a look at democracy, and some questions about modernity. Let's talk about terrorism now, inshallah. A nice light topic for Friday evening. What about Islamist terrorism? And I've put it in inverted commas deliberately because this is an expression which is very commonly heard. And as I say, I think this label is a symptom of lazy or even Islamophobic journalism. Why do I say that? So Islamist terrorist is usually used to designate groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who these groups, I think I mentioned this in the next slide, but these are groups that would consider someone who accepts democracy to be a kafir, or at the very least would be the legitimate target of a terrorist attack, so to speak. And so to describe these groups as Islamist, it's kind of weird if you think about self-designation. In fact, I have read sort of jihadi literature where they attack Islamists calling them Islamists, and they're criticizing them. So but the other problem here is this is like referring to Nazism and liberalism as part of the same movement. Okay, Nazism and liberalism both are Western post-Enlightenment ideologies. Okay, they both come out of the tradition that in a sense gave birth to modernity, which is the Age of Enlightenment, and people like Marx are major Western intellectuals, for example, in economic theory and sociology. Marx is one of the founding fathers of sociology as a discipline. But if you think about the people who inspire Nazism, they are also major figures in post-Enlightenment philosophical thinking in the West. Okay, and so if you in the West, when people talk about Nazism and liberalism, they're very careful to distinguish that these are actually, they might come out of the sort of post-Enlightenment tradition. Academics would know that. The average person might not have any familiarity with that commonality or the common genealogy. but no one in the press would go around saying Nazism and liberalism are part of the same movement, and use a term, a single term, whether it's something like post-enlightenmentism or Westernism, so to speak, to designate these sorts of things in a way that blurs the lines between them. And this is because, in my view, it's because people are a lot more careful about talking about themselves. Okay? They're not going to fudge descriptions of themselves which might confuse people into thinking that they're extremists. And Muslims in these societies are an other still, unfortunately, in the perception of the mainstream discourse very often, not always. But as a consequence of that, I think it's very easy to use this sort of language that can cause serious trouble for Muslims. Because as everyone knows, designating someone a terrorist or saying he is a terrorist sympathizer, quote unquote, is really very dangerous in society today. But in a sense, this is kind of the norm of the discourse of certain types of writers in the sort of press, usually the right-wing Islamophobic type. Rather, as I say, I think that terms like Islamism need to be dealt with greater nuance in the same way that ideas like Nazism, Marxism, communism, and liberalism would be recognized as very distinct traditions of thought, even in sort of popular journalism. Terrorism and takfeer. So groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are basically, they would declare those who accept democracy to be disbelievers, or at the very least legitimate targets of their terrorism. And this includes Islamists who are seen as sort of major opponents of these sorts of groups and competitors in the marketplace of ideas. So takfeer, as everyone here will know, is the notion of saying someone, a Muslim is not a Muslim, so to speak. So, the mainstream of Sunni Islam has always been extremely allergic to this for a whole host of reasons, but not least, I mean, there are a number of hadiths about the dangers of takfir, but one which is very commonly quoted is the statement of the Prophet, من قال لأخيه المؤمن يا كافر فقد باء به أحدهما. Okay, whoever tells his brother, you disbeliever, that statement has come back to one of those two. So, it's not something which should be taken lightly, because if the accusation is made improperly, that means the accusation comes back to themselves. Even this hadith, the scholars of Ahl Sunnah say that it doesn't literally mean the person becomes a kafir. Okay, so they point out, even this hadith is there to highlight how bad this statement is, because of various other hadiths which indicate that anyone who says La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah is a person who is a Muslim. But are Islamists free of takfir? So the Islamists, as I have defined them, can we have maybe some reflection on this question? Who thinks Islamists, as I've defined them, are free of takfir? Okay, you don't think so. All right. You think so. Okay. So it's a bit closer to what Miqdad's saying. Let me sort of, I say a bit closer, it's not exactly there, so to speak. So, and by which, when I say takfir here, I mean describing as kafir sort of Muslims who would be considered to be Muslim by the mainstream of Ahl Sunnah in general. So I'm not speaking about, for example, you will have sects historically that will very often be characterized, for example, as ghulat. And very often these sorts of sects will be said, okay, they're not actually Muslim. They don't count as Muslim in the first place. But other than that, you have the example of someone like Sayyid Qutb. And Sayyid Qutb is a very interesting figure, because in his writings, he basically says, he suggests, there are passages in his writings, in his tafsir and in Milestones, where he suggests the whole of society is living in a state of pre-Islamic ignorance, in Jahiliyyah. And he has passages where he says, for example, that these are societies which have not even smelt the scent of Islam. That might not be an exact quote, but that's kind of the theme that he has. And so he's very often called the spiritual grandfather of terrorism. Let me sort of have a presentation, then we can answer is that characterization fair? So Qutb authored a very influential tafsir. It's been translated as In the Shade of the Quran, and various literary works. So he's a great man of letters. His tafsir work is very respected among scholars and men of letters. So it's a very brilliant work of literary tafsir, and it's considered one of the finest tafsirs by many scholars of the last generation of the last century. But at the same time, it has these few passages where he speaks about Muslim societies as being in a state of jahiliyyah. And this statement has, in a sense, opened certain doors to the emergence of what was called Qutbism. And Qutbism is basically the notion that Muslim societies, the statement that Muslim societies are kind of living in a virtual state of jahiliyyah actually means they're not Muslim. Okay, you could say that that is Qutbism in a nutshell. And they were, as far as I understand, within Islamist circles, these people who believed these sorts of things were called Qutbiyin, okay, from which I'm getting the term Qutbism. And this emerges in Nasser's extremely repressive prisons as a takfiri ideology in the 1960s. So Qutb, he is basically executed in 1966 because of his writings, and it's in the 60s that in the prisons of Nasser, the so-called dungeons of Nasser, they were extremely repressive. There were all forms of horrendous torture that were applied to individuals who were in prison because they were active Islamists, and Islamists in the sense they were promoting a social program of Islamic sort of revival and the like. And in that context, you have the emergence of this ideology which says, actually, these people who are torturing us and killing us, and this society around us that is turning a blind eye to the torturing and killing of their fellow Muslims, they're all kafir. Okay, and this is a context which gives rise actually to certain groups that start perpetrating terrorist acts from the 70s onwards. And so, in the history of so-called quote-unquote Islamic terrorism, this is an important moment. As I will say later on, in history, monocausal explanation is meaningless. Okay, there are all sorts of reasons that things happen. But Shadi Hamid writes, I think in his book Temptations of Power, in his book Temptations of Power, which is, I recommend if you're interested in sort of Egyptian politics and the Muslim Brothers, he writes that extreme repression does actually give rise to violent extremism. Whereas he actually argues in that book that moderate repression actually works, which is something quite ironic, but just a side point he makes. And it's unclear whether Qutb himself ever engaged in takfir. From his writings and his statements, it doesn't seem particularly clear that he himself was engaged in this sort of activity. And so what I'm suggesting here, and I'm still doing research on this, is that Qutb his writings found a willing audience in the torture chambers of Nasser, so to speak. And that's one of the contributing strands to modern extremism. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the current head of Al-Qaeda, is someone who was also in Nasser's prisons in those times. But around that time, you have the leaders of the Muslim Brothers trying to deal with this extremist tendency that they're seeing emerge in pockets. There were still a fairly small group of people within the prison system, but there were debates, and you have this in the diaries of a lot of people who are members of the Muslim Brothers. They say that these people started saying that we're not going to pray with the rest of the Muslims here. Unless you accept our perspective that everyone is kafir around you, you're not really a Muslim either. And so they started praying their own jama'ahs and so on. In that context, the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, and this is an excellent book by Barbara Zollner, who I think is at Birkbeck College of the University of London, called The Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Hudaybi and Ideology. Hassan al-Hudaybi was the person who headed the Muslim Brothers during this period. Under his leadership, the leaders of the Muslim Brothers wrote a book called Du'at la Qudat, which translates as preachers, not judges. And it's given a nice summary in this book by Barbara Zollner. But basically there was a very specific concerted effort to try and refute this tendency. And this was, I think, first published in 1969. In a sense, this is also, that book is marks the articulation of an idea that was simmering in the Muslim Brothers at the time, that we are now going to completely renounce violence. They had a history of violence in the early first part of the 20th century. And as scholars like Gudrun Kramer writes in her biography of Hassan al-Banna, having militias was not an unusual thing for various disparate groups in Egyptian society at the time. So in a sense, that was a reflection of how small groups and scout groups would operate in those times. And this marks a point where they're renouncing violence officially. So this is around 1969 onwards. What do I have next? Okay. Oh, sorry. I hope I've not. Okay. So responses to takfir. As I've mentioned, takfir is witnessed in early Islamic history as well. So something I haven't mentioned, but takfir of the major sinner was something that the Khawarij engaged in. And these people actually murdered the Caliph Ali ibn Abi Talib. But I personally think that to say that takfir has a long history is not the same as saying that it's been a consistent problem through Islamic history. There are periods of time when it becomes a major issue. One period of time was when the Khawarij emerged. And this is why a lot of people in the modern period refer to tendencies like ISIS and Al-Qaeda as the Khawarij of these times. And they basically, one of the tendencies of the Khawarij is that they kill other Muslims. And as a consequence of the Khawarij, really, Sunnism developed a very stringent set of conditions for takfir, and strongly discouraged pronouncing takfir of other Muslims. But, unfortunately, in times of chaos, as I've put it here, or times of institutional disintegration, these sorts of rules don't really hold. And so, as I'm referring to this scholar here, someone called Bobby Sayyid, Recalling the Caliphate. It's a very fascinating book published by Hurst and Oxford University Press. And he basically argues that the proliferation of Islamic violence, so to speak, is really never going to be overcome until there's a reconstitution of a Muslim great power, which is a very interesting idea. The notion that if there are no legitimate forms of the expression of power and authority, including military authority, then Muslim societies will actually continue to produce certain tendencies where there is an expression of vigilante violence. I think it's a very interesting argument. It's something I'm still personally grappling with, exactly what the implications of that are and whether or not it is compelling. But at this point in time, I do think that there is something to be said about the fact that if you think about violence in the global Muslim community, so to speak, and the perpetration of vigilante violence, it's very often done in a context where the states against which this sort of violence is being perpetrated, or the context in which these sorts of violence are being perpetrated, are, in many respects, not representative or working actively to repress their societies. And so that sort of repression gives rise to, certain types of what I would consider illegitimate violence. And if the Muslim world were to be more unified in its sort of constitution, in the sense that people were more in line with their rulers and people felt that they were actually represented by them, this sort of violence would occur a lot less. But I conclude with this: monocausal explanations are unhelpful. Meaning, in any sort of historical analysis or in any analysis of of any kind in society, it's very problematic to be reductive and think that there is one cause for the phenomenon that we are reflecting on. And so we should always be willing to countenance nuance and complexity and try and sort of develop ourselves intellectually to that end. Jazakumullah khair, and I hope that was interesting.
Salawat. We have time for questions from inside.
I hope I wasn't too long either.
No.
Okay. I'm going to sit down for this, if that's right.
Jazakallah.
Barakallahu feek.
Usaama, I don't know if you have access to the copies of the Muslim magazine from 67, 68.
I don't actually know.
The foundation doesn't have
Well,
it.
I mean, they may have it, but I
If you
haven't
look
had a
at
look
there,
at it.
you will see 3 or 4 issues.
Right,
One is on Shaykh Sayyid Qutb.
right,
So you will see the sentiment of the Muslim student body at that time
Right.
on that.
right,
And then that is followed by one on Malcolm X.
right.
And then there is one followed by that on Mullah Maududi.
Interesting.
So they, of course, exploit 3. Sayyid Qutb, of course, you will see that at that time we as students,
Right,
Muslim students,
right,
clearly regarded it as a very, very atrocious act of repression and killing, right?
yes,
And actually that's what made us read Fizzle Out
right,
and Malik al-Tariq
Right.
and so on and so forth.
right.
I don't recall that we drew any violent conclusions from that.
Absolutely.
So this is my
Yes, yes,
own.
yes.
I mean,
Can I comment on that very quickly?
yeah.
So this is what's very interesting. The vast majority of Qutb's admirers do not read him in a violent fashion whatsoever. So you have this very interesting debate taking place in Egypt in 2009 on national TV between the Maktab al-Irshad, which is the guidance council of the Muslim Brothers, and Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's not present, but he's been interviewed in past weeks. And Yusuf al-Qaradawi has just recently published as part of his memoir certain critiques of Sayyid Qutb, saying that by implicitly doing takfeer of Muslims, he's gone outside the realms of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And everyone in the Maktab al-Irshad was saying, Sayyid Qutb never did that. We never read him in that way. If anyone read him in that way, they misunderstand him. So you have this sort of situation where, Qutb is a lot bigger than these sort of takfiri tendencies, would suggest. They are kind of a small sliver, but they get a lot of attention in Western media in particular. But the mainstream of those who admired Qutb, and especially, he was a cause célèbre throughout the Muslim world. The Iraqi prime minister, I think, was petitioning Nasser, saying, don't execute him, and so on. And I know a lot of people who tell me, I was at university reading Milestones, and I was so inspired by it as an undergraduate. This is back in the 60s and 70s. And so it means different things to different people, and that reception needs to be studied as well. I think, as an academic, I'm saying, someone needs to study the reception.
I just wanted that at that time, I don't think any of us
Right.
drew any violent inspiration.
Right.
There was more in Malcolm X to
Yes.
spur action.
Yes.
Because when he came here,
Any means necessary.
he addresses us in saying that, my brothers, revolution is bloodshed, full stop. So he doesn't
Right.
mince his words at all, right?
Yes.
But because he's not an Islamic scholar,
Yes.
there was a different impact. There's more.
Of course.
But then when we come to Mullah Maududi, it's a completely passive discourse.
Absolutely.
Absolutely passive. There is
yes.
nobody has interpreted it,
Yes.
even up to today.
Right.
Now, we looked at all this as part of a continuum.
Right.
And clearly, I think one of the things which I wanted to ask you, is this Islamic discourse, or the Muslim Brotherhood and so on, that kind of genre, a response to the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate? And so post-Caliphate, how do we see Muslim societies being
Right.
constituted?
Right.
that is so, then obviously there's a different context.
Right.
It's like saying that the Deobandis are the heart of the Taliban. That's what
Right.
it can be, but
Sure. I mean,
it's
it
not
might
that.
have been inspiration, so
Yeah.
to speak, to a certain extent, or at least in a certain facet of their ideology or sort of educational and training, so to speak. I mean, I do think, personally, I think Islamism is a consequence of the fall of political power in the Muslim world. And this is where I really find Salman Sayyid's work, or Bobby Sayyid as he's also known, work fascinating, because he's, in fact, I was going to quote another sort of scholar from North America. I can't remember where he is now, but he was quoted in The Economist about a year and a half ago, I think, on a 100-year-old mistake, which was the abolition of the Caliphate. So this is someone called Lawrence something, I forget completely. And The Economist is, I think it's Erasmus, who's saying that, you know, this is actually a plausible answer to the reason we have extremism today. Yes, it seemed like a great idea for the various powers fighting against the Ottomans, who Muslims around the world were appealing to and seeing as some sort of authority, that if they could get rid of them, this would be a major blow to the Muslim global sort of like unity and so on. But are we paying the price? That was the question of the article and the scholar in North America. Are we paying the price for perpetrating that sort of breakdown of the Caliphate? And now, of course, I mean, because the context was talking about ISIS, you know, if you don't have a good example, are you going to have all these disastrous examples of the Caliphate? And that was the argument being made by The Economist. I think there's a fascinating case to be made there, but I think very few people are writing about these. I think one of the few people writing about it is Salman Sayyid, who I quoted earlier. Yeah.
Just an add-on. How much would you attribute the rise of Muslim Brotherhood kind of thinking on people like Afghani and Abdu?
I think so. My reading of Afghani Abdu Rida is somewhat more limited. I look at a lot more recent scholars, but it's very clear that Muhammad Imara, who I quoted here, is the person who he's published all the critical editions of their works, Afghani Abdu, their complete works, and these are very significant figures of their times who were basically trying to call for what was called pan-Islamism at the time. I mean, pan-Islamism is an interesting term to use, because I think one of the things that Western scholars at the time writing about pan-Islamism were trying to suggest by using this term is this is an aberration. Okay, why are these Muslims thinking in these global terms? We're in a world of nation states. You know, we need to modernize these people. And so pan-Islamism is this kind of weird aberration. Yet, if you sort of look at the way, for example, the Muslim world is responding to Trump's comments on Jerusalem recently, that sense of global solidarity is something which Muslims very strongly feel, and it's very difficult to dismiss it if you consider scriptures. You know, if you consider the hadiths of the Prophet, which talk about, you know, the ummah being one, and that if one part of it suffers, the rest of it suffers as well. And so I think Afghani, Abdu, and Rida, who's kind of a successor, so those are three people who were influencing one another, were very much committed to that global project. Rida, so Afghani is a teacher of Abdu, Abdu is a teacher of Rida. Rida is someone who Hassan al-Banna was directly influenced by. And after his passing, I think he was asking, or I think Hassan al-Banna tried to maintain the Manar journal for a period of time as well. So yes, I think, you know, I sometimes call them proto-Islamists. But in a sense, Islamism comes into its own through the founding of organizations like Jamaat Islami and the Muslim Brothers.
I've got a couple of questions. So
Please.
you mentioned that Qaradawi has the view that secularism is an option or the option for a
He says,
minority?
in non-Muslim majority countries, al-almaniya hiya al-hal.
So the solution.
It's the solution.
Okay, so if it's the solution, I just wanted to expand that slightly.
Yes.
And so let's go to something which is highly controversial in any Muslim majority country, things like same-sex marriage, for example.
Right.
As a legal construct within a nation state,
Right.
having nothing to do with a relationship between a man and a woman, but in a legal context.
Sure.
Would that mean that Qatar would have no problem with a nation state doing secular legislation like that? Because it has no direct impact for Muslims between a man and a woman. It's a secular construct of tax affairs and what they see to be what they call marriage. It's a different construct altogether. That's the first of a couple.
So, should I address that? So Qaradawi is talking about in non-Muslim societies which have plural environments, they can, and I would suspect that he would say, obviously from a Muslim perspective, this is something that we consider morally problematic. We do not accept this. This is shudud, etc. The term actually for homosexuality in Arabic is still, the main term used is deviance, shudud, so to speak. So that's the perspective that he would carry. But then, he would probably say that what non-Muslims do among themselves is not our business. And this goes back to a debate, an old debate in usul al-fiqh. هل الكفار مخاطبون بفروع الشريعة? Are disbelievers required to follow the furu' of the Sharia? And I think if I recall correctly, the majority say no. Okay, and the minority that say yes they're required to follow fiqh, but even if they follow it without being Muslim, it doesn't count for anything, so to speak.
So on that directly, that means that Muslims in a non-Muslim state would have no necessarily obligation or even encouragement to promote any moral code if they see it in a non-Muslim context, because it's nothing to do with them. It's what non-Muslims do, which is entirely, because what you're saying here is that this is an Islamic legal precept which is not applicable to a non-Muslim, and therefore what they do is, it's not a global morality, it's an Islamic morality, if that's...
Absolutely. And I mean, so I'm going to have to speculate about what he would, but as someone who's read him reasonably well, I would speculate that it would be a yes and no to that, because these scholars, people like Abdullah ibn Bayya as well, they've theorized Islamic minorities and their fiqh and so on. They say that if a person is concerned that they or their families will not be able to maintain their religious identities, it's an obligation for them to leave, number one. Number two is, in an environment where they want to maintain their own religious identity, they might still see it as prudential to support legislation that will be closer to their belief system, because that is likely to have an impact on them down the line, so to speak. So there are always different ways of approaching these things, and I think I would hope that these sorts of scholars would be reflective on all of the parameters of these sorts of concerns. Yeah.
So following also from what you said about whether non-Muslims have to follow the furu' of Islam, in a Muslim majority country, when you're coming into a situation where again, there are Islamic legal precepts versus others, alcohol being the clearest one. Is the position of the majority of Islamists, whatever you would call them, be that alcohol should be entirely free to be sold and bought and sold, as long as there are clear and unequivocal restrictions to them being sold and bought by non-Muslims only, and only consumed in a way that the consequences of that alcohol is only within a non-Muslim context? Would that be something that would be completely fine? I
think so, yeah. I mean, but I don't think that's uniquely Islamist. I mean, this is how it was in the classical fiqh works. I mean, the Hanafis have I'm sort of trained in the Hanafi madhab, and I recall in the sort of discussions of theft, for example, there's an interesting mas'ala where if a Christian steals a bottle of wine from a Muslim, there's nothing to be done about that. Okay. Whereas if a Muslim steals a bottle of wine from a Christian, then it's considered to be valuable, and he has to return it, or at least if he's broken it, he has to sort of give the value of the money. The reverse is not true, and this is because non-Muslim minorities do have the rights of transact things which are not considered. This is according to the Hanafi madhab. I don't know about other schools, but I would suspect there would be analogous circumstances in other schools. Yeah.
Final question is on Islamist terrorism. Obviously, you said that phrase is problematic,
Yep.
even Islamophobic.
Yep.
Throughout the rest of your talk, when you're talking about that concept,
Yes.
you're using the term Islamic terrorism. Although you're saying Islamic
I said once, I think, in inverted commas.
In inverted commas.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, a term needs to be, or
Yeah.
it needs to be used.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering, other than using Islamic terrorism, which would be very difficult and probably more problematic in some respects,
Yes. Yes.
do you have any proposal as to what that term really should be?
I have to think about this. I mean, I haven't. Sometimes I will sort of, in an academic context, I can use language which I can be reasonably confident that I won't be misconstrued. But when you're speaking to the public setting, which I don't do very often, to be honest, and particularly if you're speaking in a media context, then it's a lot more tricky, and I have to think about that. Unfortunately, I would suspect using terms like jihadism might be better, but then jihad is a respected concept in the Islamic tradition as well. It's a very positive concept in the Islamic tradition, but jihadism, these groups very often call themselves jihadiyin. Yeah, but that's very technical. I mean, it's not. It doesn't make sense to a non-Arab or a non-Muslim, so to speak, generally. It's there might be certain types of certain categories of quote-unquote terrorism which might not fall under that category necessarily. But yes, I mean I think that's better than Islamic terrorism. I mean, Islamic terrorism is an oxymoron, quote-unquote. It's a terrible oxymoron at that. So yeah, I hope that's.
Thank you.
I just wanted to start off by giving you an anecdote. Actually,
Okay.
I convened a group of journalists,
Right.
and on the one side, journalists who write about terrorism all the time, and on the other side, academics, and they could not come to a consensus. And the journalists were quite angry with the academics. It's all well and good with your 6,000 words. We have to write our headline in 10 words.
Yes.
And if you can't give us an alternative, we will continue using that term. So I think do some more homework on your front.
I should. I mean, I do have in my introduction.
Because we can complain all we like.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, an attempt has been made to try and describe these guys as Daesh. But even then, people don't like that.
But I mean, there are other challenges as well, which are that there are certain convenient phrases that are very frequently used by political actors, in the public space, and those have far more purchase in mainstream discourse than anything an academic will come up with as a term. I mean, I liked it when I think the Reuters or AFP, I can't remember, they had their style guide changed after Islamists were elected in Egypt. And they said, actually, Islamism is a lot broader than the way we're using it. It's both, broader and also narrower in the sense that it doesn't necessarily refer to terrorism. But after the coup in Egypt and, the successive repressive regimes in trying to quell and ongoing attempts to do that, they kind of reverted to their old usages. And I think someone like Miqdad is in a very sort of unique position that he engages the public discourse, and he can perhaps put forward an idea and it might be taken somewhat seriously. So, it does behoove someone like myself as an academic to engage with someone like Miqdad and have that conversation. But for most people, in our internal Muslim discourse, if we develop a term, it won't have an impact on the mainstream unless you are a part of that mainstream discourse in a significant way.
I actually had a question.
Yes, please.
You were describing how the difficulties mainstream Islamists have with takfeerism.
Right.
I want to know how they would deal with pluralism within Islam.
Right.
And within you talked about Salafis, Sufis, and
Sure.
Islamists.
Sure.
When it comes to governance, and there are
Right.
different points of views,
Right.
what they do with that,
Right.
and also the litmus test was after the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood government, and it is accused of, if you're being charitable, it had difficulties with, for example, protecting minorities in Egypt. Now, one would say it stoked, others would say, you know, it turned a blind eye.
Right.
So in that litmus test,
Yes.
it was found wanting.
Right.
And then the other point on authoritarianism, the other litmus test has been Turkey, where the accusation "one vote, one time" is proving to be true. Some would say.
One vote, one time, and then again every 4 years, but to the same guy.
To the same guy.
No, that's fair enough.
You know, in that front, how does that work in terms of what you've just described?
So, I mean, that's a pretty large question. Let me try and address it as fairly as I can. So, the case of the Muslim Brothers and the case of Turkey. So, with respect to religious minorities, and the other case, you know, sticking Muslim. Okay. So, Muslim religious minorities, and also you were saying, so specifically Muslim religious minorities. I think, you know, these are societies where, personally, I think, you know, Islamist discourse and actually Islamic discourse on religious minorities is, in my view, behind the times. Okay. But I also say in my dissertation, hopefully, which will be my first book, that you know, as indicated by people like John Bowen, who has a great book called Why the French Don't Like Headscarves, published by Princeton University Press, and Anwar Iman, who has a book called Religious Pluralism in Islamic Law, where, I mean, if you read, you know, what classical scholars of fiqh said about how religious minorities should be treated, you'd think, you know, no one should be complaining in modern times. Both of these scholars also indicate that when it comes to the West dealing with religious minorities, and we don't get too bad a situation in a place like the UK, but in various parts of the West, religious minorities have a very hard time, and specifically Muslim religious minorities. They're seen with great suspicion. There are all sorts of, you know, restrictions and bans and so on, religious symbols, or wearing, you know, burkini, or wearing a niqab in public and things like that. Those sorts of problems, which was upheld, I think, in the European Court about wearing the hijab in the workplace and so on. Those sorts of things reflect a problem which is common to most jurisdictions. And Anwar Iman, who's a University of Toronto law professor, basically, you know, says that these are things where we all need to sort of work harder and try and figure out what's a good way to deal with modern pluralism. Charles Taylor, who I didn't quote explicitly today, but is a major theorist of secularism, also says that the major challenge of secularism is to deal with religious pluralism, because if we stick to notions of separation of church and state, that emerged in the context of Christian pluralism, but it doesn't work well when the sort of range of religious outlooks is more diverse. So on the pluralism side, religious pluralism side, I think everyone still has a challenge, and these have to be theoretical, you know, engagements, but they also have to be very practical conversations about reasonable accommodation. And I think multiculturalism and the discourse on reasonable accommodation is a good step in the right direction, but there needs to be, you know, more on that. With respect to a place like Turkey, I think. And authoritarianism, and I think you know, a lot of us see someone like Erdogan and think, you know, are worried, so to speak. And also, I have conversations occasionally with my Muslim brothers and sisters, and I see that there's kind of sometimes a blind faith in a figure like Erdogan as well, which I think is very unhealthy. Okay. You know, no one is ma'soom after the Prophet, according to Sunni belief at the very least, and even in among the Shia, it's only restricted to the A'imma, so to speak. So, so when it comes to these sorts of tendencies, I think there are a couple of things to bear in mind. There's a huge amount of polarization in a place like Turkey, and Muslims who feel globally disenfranchised. I remember when I think the war on southern Lebanon from Israel in 2006, I think it was, and everyone was in love with Hassan Nasrallah because he won. And I remember people saying, it's only Nasrullah and Bin Laden who are doing anything for the Ummah. I remember sort of hearing people say things like this. And I was quite shocked. But this global sense of disenfranchisement results in looking for these sorts of figures. And Erdogan has become one of these people, and he taps into it very successfully. As soon as something happens somewhere which is of global Muslim concern, whether it's the Rohingya, whether it's the recent statement of Jerusalem and saying Jerusalem is a red line for Muslims, he's taken on this role of being the Muslim global figure, so to speak. And so there is that sort of conflictual situation for a lot of Muslim admirers of a person like Erdogan. But I do think that there are specific historical contexts for these sorts of this kind of behavior. And I don't think that it should be generalized in the way that, I forget the name of the State Department official who made that statement, one vote, one person, one vote, one time. But that sort of Orientalist fantasy, which just helps them perpetuate the autocratic status quo in the region, is just a self-serving platitude as far as I'm concerned. And if you look at the historical reasons for, certain actors behaving in certain ways, I think it's a lot more complex. I certainly can sort of vouch for the theoretical sophistication of what they describe as tadawul as-sulutat, or term limits in Islamist discourse. But when the rubber hits the road, that really is a question to see whether they can live up to it in a meaningful way. And I think in the case of Turkey, because of the sort of, I'm sorry, this is such a long-winded answer, but because the region is kind of going through all sorts of instability since the Iraq War of 2003, people like Erdogan probably look at themselves and think, I'm indispensable, so to speak. And so there will be efforts, cognitive dissonant efforts, to justify their own perpetuation of power. It's a concern. I hope I've expressed that.
It is reaching 10 o'clock. Omar wanted to ask one as well, but it is.
Sorry, I can answer very briefly if you like in future. And I feel a bit concerned that I haven't given any sisters names. Oh, okay. No interest. All right.
Final question, but brief if possible.
I'll keep it as brief as I can. 2 questions. First of all, both equally brief.
Okay.
First of all, to what extent do you find yourself trapped by the conventional discourse of Western academia when coming to talk about Muslim organizations and movements? In trying, as you say,
it's not a brief question, but okay.
If the Islamiyun are a response to the imposition of the nation state and the dissolution of traditional Muslim organizations, right, is there a discourse from within defining our own political theory there?
Sure.
First of all.
Yes.
Secondly, you've focused very much on actors within the last 15 years,
yes,
with a hint of Hassan al-Hudaybi in the 1960s and 70s, without really tracing out a trajectory of relationships with the state, or looking at the idea of wikala in this matter,
right,
or looking at when you can remove yourself from the state, when you can rebel against the state. And the reason I ask this is that the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly in Egypt, in the early days of the Arab Spring, was one of removal from the street. It stayed back from the street.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The official Brotherhood.
And acted almost hand in glove with the regime, which eventually...
And even after sort of like they came to power, they were acting as closely as possible with SCAF for a good period of time, and they were criticized for that by the revolutionaries, so to speak.
Until SCAF essentially ate them up through Sisi.
Yeah, I mean, I think SCAF ate everyone up, but including the revolutionaries, unfortunately. I mean, so let me try and answer as briefly as possible. I mean, I'm obviously restricted to a certain extent. I'm still writing my PhD by the conventions of my field. And I'm in a Western university, and so there, I don't speak as a theologian. I'm in a department of Near Eastern Studies, so I speak as a historian, as an outside observer, so to speak. And I obviously am very attentive to the fact that I'm a Muslim, and the fact that I'm a religious Muslim at that. So those are conversations that I engage with, very, very seriously, and hopefully, as time passes, I will be able to theorize that a lot better. I think there are scholars like Bobby Sayyid that have mentioned Wael Hallaq, increasingly, who's not a Muslim, but he engages in very interesting intra-Islamic debates, who are changing the way in which Near Eastern studies can operate as a field. And hopefully that will open up spaces, increasing numbers of Muslims, people like Jonathan Brown as well, who are openly identifying as Muslim and engaging in a new kind of discourse. The other question about, this presentation reflects my own very narrow range of research. I'm more interested in articulating the perspectives and articulating, analyzing, and critiquing the perspectives of Islamists from the last 20 years, more or less. The historical developments, I think, are very important, but I don't really look at them very much. And I think your observations are absolutely right about the Muslim Brothers and how they responded to the Egyptian revolution. And I remember seeing people applaud them, saying that, oh, these people are interacting with the military. I don't know if you remember, it seems like an eon ago now, but when he sidelined SCAF and appointed Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, everyone was saying, oh, he's done such an amazing coup, so to speak. And, the naivete was, hindsight is 20/20. But people were making comparisons with the AKP in Turkey and saying, oh, the same way that the AKP marginalized the military, the Muslim Brothers are following the same sort of line. And so, when there are actual instances of the rubber hitting the road, I think it gets very messy. I'm a theorist. I don't even really look at the political actors. I'm more interested in the intellectuals, as you might have noticed. So I can't comment very effectively on them, I'm afraid.
I just
it's
want
fine.
to
I can stay here all night, but I'm a bit concerned about people falling asleep.
push the debate to the logical conclusion. Right. Would you see the present-day efforts of Al-Nahda as the logical endpoint of Islamism?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, I think they've taken a very interesting tack, calling themselves Muslim Democrats, separating the religious part of the party from the political movement and so on. I'm someone who I don't see that history determines very much. I'm not an absolute relativist by any means, but I think there are all sorts of possibilities of the directions in which Islamists can go, and Muslims in general. But I personally think that based on I can give you a summary of my dissertation, which is to say that Islamists, among all the denominations of Sunnism that I've mentioned, engage in the most rigorous way, intellectually speaking, with modernity, but it's still desperately wanting, so to speak. So there's a lot of theoretical work to be done, and that needs to be accompanied by the actual ability to put into practice, do testing and things like that, before we can get any sort of coherence in a system overall.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to end there.
Jazakumullah khair. No, it's been fascinating.
Salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad.
Thank you very much. Just a quick